Hello, and welcome to a guide to voting in Texas in 2020. We hope you find this presentation useful as you prepare to learn how to vote in Texas this year. We're going to go ahead and get started and talk about our agenda for this presentation. We're going to cover four main areas today, which is why is it important to vote, registering to vote in Texas, how to vote in Texas during COVID-19, elections in the US, and we're going to cover primary elections, runoff elections, and the general election. Before we get started, we want to note that this presentation is only for educational purposes and should not be considered legal advice. The information contained in this presentation is only meant to educate you about your rights and responsibilities. It is also meant to provide information and prepare people for the voting process, but should not be considered legal advice. Now, let's talk a little bit about the benefits of US citizenship. If you were not born in this country and you have the ability to naturalize, you should consider doing so. There are many benefits to US citizenship. Some of them are listed here, and they are being able to vote, obtaining a US passport, starting the process to bring some of your family members to the US, the ability to qualify for more scholarships and grants, the ability to run for certain government offices, and expanded government benefits. Now, let's go ahead and kick off on why is it important to vote? We believe that voting provides collective power. Since 2014, over 5.3 million people have become naturalized citizens of the United States. In Texas, nearly 500,000 people have become naturalized citizens since 2014. That is enough to change election results across the state and dramatically change the future of Texas. As a citizen, you have the power to vote and help decide the future of Texas and the US. This presentation will help explain what that means and the power that you have. So let's talk a little bit about what it's like to vote in the US. The first thing you should note is that voting in the US is private. Every vote you cast is kept secret by law so that nobody, including the government, can know who you voted for. If somebody asks who you voted for, you do not have to tell them. Second, voting in the United States is safe from violence and intimidation. It is illegal for anyone to intimidate you at the voting booth or to try to prevent you from voting. Voting locations are safe and protected places so that you are able to express your opinion safely. Third, voting in the United States allows you to disagree. If you do not like the current government or an elected official, the voting booth is a place to voice that. Because voting is private and safe, your disagreement with the government cannot be used against you. Now, how do you register to vote in Texas and what are the requirements? Every state has different guidelines that you need to meet in order to register to vote, and these guidelines are specific to registering in Texas. First, you must be a citizen of the United States to register to vote. That means that if you were not born here, you must have applied for and gone through the naturalization process in order to register to vote. Second, you must be 17 years and 10 months old to register, and you must turn 18 before Election Day. Third, you must be a resident of your state at least 30 days immediately before the election. This means that you must have a home or apartment address in Texas in the county you're registering in. The election this year is November 3rd, which means you must be a resident of Texas by at least October 5th. October 5th is also the deadline to register to vote. Finally, you must not be incarcerated for a felony crime or have a felony on your record. Additionally, if you have been ruled by a court to be mentally incapacitated, you are also not able to register to vote. So let's talk a little bit about how to register to vote in Texas. We want to bring special attention to the fact that you cannot register to vote in Texas online. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide, but you cannot register to vote online in the state of Texas. So how can you register to vote? Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we encourage you to fill out the online voter registration form and mail it to your county's voter registrar office. The link to the form is the first link on this slide. To find the address of your county's voter registrar office, follow the second link on this slide. We will give more instructions on mailing the form on the next slide. Texas does offer voter registration forms that come with free postage so that you do not have to buy a stamp, and you can request that by calling your voter registrar's office, also at the link on this slide. I will make a note here that you can fill out the voter registration form online, but you can't submit it online. Filling it out online only allows you to print it out and then mail it. If you do not have a stamp or are not able to get a voter registration form with free postage, you can find your U.S. Post Office nearest to you, and there you will be able to purchase a stamp and envelope for under $2. You may also be able to visit your county's voter registrar office in person, though there may be restrictions due to COVID-19. So please call your voter registrar office ahead of time using this link to find their phone number. Finally, you can also register with a volunteer deputy registrar. Many nonprofit organizations have specialized volunteers that have gone through this training to be able to register people to vote. Please check with a nonprofit near you to see if this is something that they are able to offer. So what do you need to be able to register to vote? As you will notice on your voter registration sheet when you have one, you will be required to provide a personal identification number when you register to vote. This number must come from one of three places: your driver's license, a personal identification number issued by the Texas Department of Public Safety, or your social security number. If you have none of the above, you may still register, but will be asked to show a photo ID when you vote. We do want to note, and it's very important that you know that the deadline to register to vote in this year's general election is October 5th, 2020. So, getting ready to vote. If you are planning to vote in November, here's what you should be doing to get ready. 2 or 3 weeks after you have registered to vote, you should receive your voter registration card in the mail. And this picture on the screen right now is a sample of what your voter registration card looks like. This card will tell you what county you live in, as well as what congressional districts you live in. You can also find this information online at the link on this slide. Make sure to find a photo ID to bring with you to vote on election day. Your ID must either be current or have expired less than 4 years ago. On the next slide, we've included a list of acceptable forms of IDs and alternatives. So one of these acceptable forms of ID is what you can use to vote. The first is a Texas driver's license, followed by a Texas election ID certificate, a Texas personal ID certificate or card, a Texas handgun license, a U.S. citizenship certificate with your photo, a U.S. military ID card with your photo, and a U.S. passport. If you do not have any of those, you may still qualify for a reasonable impediment declaration. In order to qualify for this, you would show a copy of one of these instead: a court admissible birth document, a current utility bill, a bank statement, a government check, a paycheck, or a government document with your name and address, including your voter registration certificate. So, how do you choose who to vote for? We cannot tell you who to vote for, but we can provide you with information and resources to help you make an informed decision. You are able to research and find candidates who align with your values. There are many resources online where you can learn about candidates and the issues that matter to you. We have included a program from Ballotpedia that shows you every person you can vote for this November. Some candidates have their platforms and policies on the Ballotpedia website. If a candidate does not, you can search their name online to find out more about them. We will also email you these links to other voting guides that will help you learn more about your candidates. Some of the links on here include Vote 411 and the Ballotpedia website. So, how do you vote during a pandemic? Because of the ongoing pandemic, we encourage you to vote during early voting period. While Election Day is November 3rd, you will be able to vote in person any day between October 13th and October 30th. You must vote in the same county that you live in. This option will be safer than voting on Election Day, as the voting locations will be less busy. If you are unable to vote early, you are still able to vote on Election Day, November 3rd. If you vote on November 3rd, be prepared for longer lines, more people present, and a wait. Voting by mail. Some voters are also eligible to vote by mail. If you are 65 or older, disabled, out of the county on Election Day and during the early voting period, or in jail, but still eligible to vote, you can find instructions for voting by mail at this link on this slide. The county must receive your application for a mail-in ballot by October 23rd. So we recommend you mail in that application at least a week in advance or by October 16th. Now, let's talk a little bit about Fabiola. Fabiola is a first-time voter, and she became a citizen last year to ensure that she could be here for her kids without the fear of deportation. She naturalized in time to vote in her first primary election, and she's really excited to vote in the presidential election this fall. She looks forward to voting for a leader that will take her and her community further than they are right now forward. We hope that if this was going to be the first time that many of you are voting, you're also able to share your story of why voting matters to you this election. Now, let's talk a little bit about who you can vote for in November. When you go to vote this November or during the early voting period, you will find many different elections on your ballot for national, state, and local positions. This slide does not include all of them, but includes some of the important elections that you will be able to voice your opinion on. They include the President and Vice President of the United States, your representative in the U.S. House of Representatives, the U.S. Senator from Texas, your representative in the Texas House of Representatives, and other local and national state positions depending on where you live. Remember, the links on this slide help you find a nonpartisan sample ballot that you can look to for guidance. Now, how do elections in Texas work? In the United States, there are multiple rounds of voting before a candidate has won the office. This applies to elections for nearly every elected position. Here are the 3 types of elections you can vote in: the primary elections, the runoff elections, and the general election. We will explain what these are in the next couple of slides. First is the primary election. During an election year, multiple candidates from each political party often run for the same position. In order to choose the strongest candidate, parties will hold primary elections where the voters of that party decide which candidate they most prefer. The winner of the primary becomes the party's nominee and faces the other party's nominees in the general election. An example of this is the 2020 Democratic primary. Democrats from all 50 states voted, and the numbers you see reflect the delegates from each state the candidate has won. These delegates are awarded to a candidate based on the votes they win in each state. As you can see, former Vice President Joe Biden won the most delegates and will be the Democratic Party's nominee. He will face Donald Trump, the Republican nominee, as well as the nominees from smaller parties in the general election in November. Next is a runoff election. In Texas, for all elections except for the president, if no candidate in the primary receives more than 50% of the votes in their party's primary, the 2 candidates which receive the most votes face off in a runoff election. Like the primary election, runoff elections take place within a political party. Whichever candidate wins the runoff will proceed to the general election. An example of the runoff elections is the results from the Democratic Party's primary and runoff election for U.S. Senator from Texas. In the primary election, no candidate got over 50% of the vote. Mary Jennings Hagar and Royce West earned the most votes, so they then faced off in the runoff elections, which happened a few months later. In the runoff elections, Mary Jennings Hagar got over 50% of the vote and won. This means she will be facing current U.S. Senator John Cornyn in the general election this November. And finally, we have the general election. Once all parties have conducted their primaries, the winners from each party face off against each other in the general election. Whoever wins this election wins the elected position. While the primaries and runoffs have already happened this year, you are still able to vote in the general election on November 3rd. Thank you so much for watching this presentation, and we really hope it was valuable to you. This presentation and all of the materials in it will be sent to you via email. We want to say special thanks to the following organizations for their support in making this presentation possible: Ladies Let's Talk, Church World Service, and Refugee Council USA.